I was fumbling with the lock when I heard her voice behind me. "You've been out late again." I froze, keys half in the door. She stood there in the hallway, the muted yellow light catching the strands of silver in her hair, the way her sweater bunched at her wrists. Mid-40s, sharp eyes that missed nothing, and somehow not intimidating, just aware. My landlady, my neighbor, the only person I'd seen more than a handful of times but whose presence already had a kind of weight. Yeah, work ran late," I said, avoiding her gaze. She smirked, that subtle half-smile that didn't quite reach her eyes but made the space between us feel warmer. Then she turned the key in her own door, closed it behind us. The click sounded heavier than it should have. Inside, the apartment smelled faintly of jasmine and old books. I kicked off my shoes awkwardly, my hands fidgeting with the straps of my backpack. She leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching me, not impatient but not invisible either. "You still take it black?" she asked. I blinked. "The coffee?" Somehow she remembered. "Yeah," I murmured, surprising myself with how small the sound felt. She nodded, already moving toward the kitchen. The scrape of her slippers on the wood floor was loud in the quiet. I watched her hands, the way she picked up the French press like it belonged to her, not to anyone else. Tiny habits, I noticed. We sat at opposite ends of her tiny dining table, the air punctuated by the faint hiss of boiling water. I stirred my cup absent-mindedly, folding the napkin under it, watching her flick her eyes to mine once, twice, like she was waiting for permission to say something more. "You never actually drink it all," she said finally, nodding toward my half-empty cup. I looked down, unsure if she was teasing or observing. I like the first sip best." She smiled, a little wider this time, and leaned back. "That's fair." We didn't say much after that. Silence stretched in comfortable patches, only broken by the occasional clink of mugs. I realized how much I had missed quiet company, without it having to mean anything at all. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Unsent texts waiting in drafts, messages I couldn't bring myself to hit send. I ignored it. At one point, I found my gaze lingering on the line of her jaw as she tilted her head, listening to the faint hum of the fridge. She noticed. Our eyes met. I looked away, heart a little too loud. And then, just as I thought I could leave without further complication, she said, "You should come by tomorrow. I'll have the espresso ready." Her smirk lingered, just enough to suggest that it wasn't only about the coffee. My stomach tightened in a mix of dread and anticipation, the kind that made me rewind conversations in my head that hadn't even happened yet. I nodded, fumbling with my words. "Sure. Yeah, that'd be nice." She didn't comment. Just a quiet nod, a turn toward her door, and the faint smell of jasmine followed me out as I stepped back into the hallway. The lock clicked behind me, but her presence lingered, and I walked away thinking, why does an ordinary invitation feel like the start of everything? The next afternoon, I found myself knocking on her door, my hands awkwardly twisting the straps of my backpack. She opened it before I could knock again, smirk in place, eyes curious but guarded. "Espresso's ready," she said. Nothing more, nothing less. I stepped inside. The apartment felt warmer than yesterday, not just in temperature, but in the way her presence occupied the space without crowding it. She poured the coffee, hands careful, precise, and set a mug in front of me. I noticed how her fingers lingered on the handle longer than necessary, just a whisper of awareness. "You always sit here," she said, nodding toward the small chair by the window. I shrugged. "The light's better." My voice sounded small, almost too honest. She sipped her coffee, eyes on the steam curling from the cup. Then, unexpectedly, she said, "I didn't grow up here. Moved when I was 20. Never thought I'd stay this long." Her words were casual, but I felt the weight behind them. The apartment felt lived in a way that wasn't just furniture and books. It carried the echo of her choices, the quiet loneliness she rarely spoke about. I nodded, trying to respond, but the words stuck. Instead, I stirred my coffee slowly, letting my gaze wander to the chipped windowsill. I imagined the life she'd left behind, the reasons she might have for staying small, quiet, careful. And for some reason, that made me ache. We fell into silence, the kind that didn't need filling. I helped her pick up a stray book from the floor, our hands brushing. She noticed. Her eyes flicked to mine for a fraction of a second, and I felt it, an acknowledgement that maybe this moment meant something we weren't supposed to name. "Do you miss it?" I asked, voice hesitant more than I intended. "The past?" she said. "Sometimes. Mostly, I just try to make the present tolerable." Her honesty hung between us, soft but weighty. I wanted to say something clever, comforting, or at least reassuring, but instead I nodded again, feeling my own truths too obvious to speak aloud. My job, my apartment, the quiet evenings I spent scrolling through unsent texts. All of it suddenly seemed fragile, tentative, as if shared in her presence. She reached for a small teapot and poured us another cup. Steam curled around her face, and I caught the faintest smile playing on her lips. My hand brushed against the table's edge, close enough to hers that I felt the warmth, the subtle pulse of life, without crossing any line. "I shouldn't," she murmured, almost to herself. "Shouldn't what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. She didn't answer directly. Instead, she tapped the rim of her cup with her finger and looked up at me, just long enough that I could see the conflict flickering behind her calm. I realized then that this being here, just this quietly, safely close, was more dangerous than any confession. Yet, somehow, it felt like the first time someone had noticed me for more than my routine, my habit, my ordinary self. I left that afternoon carrying the lingering warmth of her gaze, her hesitation, the faint trace of jasmine in the air. I don't know why that moment stayed with me. Maybe because it felt like someone finally saw me. I found her in the hallway again, this time carrying a bag of groceries heavier than it looked. "Here, let me—" I reached, but she shook her head. "I've got it." Her voice was soft, almost dismissive, but the way she tilted the bag toward me, just slightly, made me pause. She was close, too close. My fingers brushed hers, and I recoiled slightly, pretending it didn't matter. We moved into the kitchen. I put down my backpack, avoiding her eyes. She hummed quietly, sorting vegetables. I watched the rhythm of her movements, how her shoulders tensed when she bent, how the light caught the faint lines at her temples. Small things, tiny signals I didn't want to read. "You're quiet today," she said, not looking up. Yeah. Busy?" I murmured, words trailing. I wanted to tell her about the text I almost sent this morning, the one I deleted at the last second. I wanted to tell her about how lonely the apartment felt without her small interruptions, the way she made space feel human. But I didn't. She leaned on the counter closer than usual. I could smell the faint perfume she always wore. Something tugged at my chest, like gravity had shifted. I wanted to step closer, wanted to say something, anything, but my brain froze. And then, just as I gathered the courage to speak, her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, frowned, and the spell broke. Her shoulders straightened, her distance returned. The tension evaporated, leaving only an awkward quiet. "Sorry," she said, putting the phone down. "Work stuff." I nodded, pretending the pulse in my throat wasn't audible. I moved to help her chop vegetables, but my hand hovered over the counter too long, caught in hesitation. She noticed. She glanced at me, eyes sharp for a second, then softened. We worked side by side, silently measuring, slicing, passing items. My fingers brushed hers again, this time longer. Neither of us pulled away immediately. A beat passed. My stomach tightened. I imagined leaning forward, leaning in, but the moment shattered as a neighbor's door slammed somewhere down the hall. Her eyes flicked toward the sound, and she smiled faintly, apologetically, but the tension between us didn't vanish. It shifted, condensed, waiting. Later, she handed me a cup of tea, and I noticed the way her thumb lingered on the rim, almost brushing my hand. My pulse jumped. I wanted to speak, to confess, to reach, but my hands stayed flat on the table, still. She was watching me, quiet, unreadable. "Thanks," I said. Her gaze met mine. "Not too long, just enough." The space between us felt charged. My throat tightened. For a fraction of a second, I pictured leaning forward, letting my lips meet hers, just this once, just a tiny crossing of a line. She moved then, slightly, almost imperceptibly, and the moment passed. My hands fell to my lap, my stomach twisting with disappointment and relief all at once. I left that evening carrying the memory of her gaze, the faint warmth of her touch, the almost thoughts that neither of us dared speak aloud. I ran into her outside, near the small park behind her building. The late afternoon sun slanted through the trees, casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. She was crouched down tying her sneakers, the groceries from earlier still tucked in a bag beside her. "Hey," I said, a little too loud, and she jumped slightly. "Oh," she murmured, brushing a strand of hair from her face. She looked up, and for a moment, the smirk I'd grown familiar with flickered into something softer. Maybe guarded, maybe vulnerable. We walked together along the path, silence filling the spaces between the crunch of leaves under our feet. I wanted to reach out, wanted to ask her something I didn't have words for. Instead, I let my hands hang at my sides, noticing the way her jacket brushed against her wrists. Small, ordinary details, but ordinary things felt charged when she was near. "So," she said finally, "did you talk to your friend yesterday?" I swallowed. "Yeah." "Why?" Her eyes flicked toward mine, not accusatory, just watching. "Nothing. Just people notice things. Sometimes." Pang went through me. Was it jealousy? Embarrassment? Or the kind of longing that made my chest ache without warning? I clenched my hands into fists at my sides, pretending I wasn't shaking. We paused on a bench near the fountain. She sat first, folding her hands in her lap, looking at the water instead of me. I hesitated, then lowered myself beside her, leaving a fraction of space between us that felt both infinite and unbearably close. "I shouldn't say this," she murmured. Her voice was low, a thread of confession suspended in the air. "But sometimes I wonder if I'm making it harder than it has to be." I didn't respond immediately. My heart was too loud. My mind raced, imagining 100 ways that line could end. Her hand brushing mine, her gaze dropping, the space collapsing. I wanted to reach for her. I wanted to tell her I felt the same, even if it was wrong, even if it was temporary, even if the world said it shouldn't exist. Instead, I said nothing. Just let the silence sit between us, heavy and sharp, the fountain's water rushing like a reminder that time keeps moving even when you freeze. Her hand twitched toward her coat pocket, a small, almost unconscious gesture. I noticed. She looked at me then, eyes steady, but for the first time I saw the conflict entirely exposed. Age, loneliness, longing, guilt. All of it mapped on her face in subtle shifts. I don't know what I want," she said, quietly, almost like she was talking to herself. "And maybe you don't either." I wanted to argue, to reassure, to tell her that I did, that I had for a while. But my words failed me. We sat there, shoulder to shoulder, watching water ripple in the late sunlight. The moment felt suspended, fragile, poised on the edge of something we weren't ready to cross. And I realized, with a twist in my chest, that one wrong word, or one small movement, could undo everything. Could I risk it? I showed up that evening like I always did, cup in hand, keys jangling, ready to greet her smirk. But the hallway was empty. I knocked lightly, no answer. Then again, still nothing. The faint hum of the city filtered through the walls, but it didn't fill the quiet that suddenly felt hollow. I pressed my ear to her door. Just silence. I imagined she was inside, pretending she didn't hear or maybe avoiding me. My stomach twisted with something I couldn't name. Annoyance? Fear? Longing? All of it? I sat on the steps outside, backpack resting against my knees, stirring a cup of cold coffee I hadn't touched. A few minutes passed. Then her door opened, slowly, but she didn't smile. She just looked at me, eyes wary, unreadable. "I can't tonight," she said. Her voice was soft but distant, clipped. No explanation, no warmth, just that phrase. And then she closed the door. I stayed on the steps longer than necessary, hands resting on my knees, staring at the small cracks in the concrete. My phone buzzed. A message from her, but not the usual playful tease or invitation. Just a fragment. Things aren't. And then nothing. Drafts saved mid-thought. I wondered if it was about him, the ex she'd never mentioned, or the child she only occasionally spoke of in passing. Something in her life I wasn't supposed to see. A door she kept closed. I imagined every possibility, each one heavier than the last. I tried to replay our last walk, the bench, the fountain. The way she had leaned back, hesitant, almost exposing herself. The way my own hands itched to cross the line. And now, the distance felt like a wall, a shift I couldn't explain. I went home, sat at my desk, unopened texts piling up. I drafted replies to her that never sent, rewrote confessions I didn't have the courage to make. My thoughts circled endlessly, stuck on the tension between what had been and what had been pulled away. The next day, I stopped by her building again, hoping for some small reassurance, some smile, a casual gesture that said the world hadn't tilted. But the mailbox was full, the hallway quiet. A chair left empty by her window caught my eye, sunlight spilling over it, mocking in its stillness. I didn't feel heartbroken. I felt paused, like life forgot to finish the sentence. Her absence became a presence of its own, a constant reminder that the fragile connection we'd nurtured could vanish in a single gesture, or in a single closed door. And the pause, it was heavier than anything I'd known. I left before sunset, backpack heavier than when I'd arrived. A draft saved, a knock unsent, a space left empty. I didn't plan to see her that evening. The walk from my apartment to hers was automatic, almost unconscious, like my feet remembered what my head hadn't yet admitted. She opened the door before I could knock. No smirk this time, just that soft guarded look, like she'd been waiting and also afraid. "Hey," I said, voice smaller than I meant. "Hey," she replied, shoulders slightly hunched. The groceries from earlier in the week still sat on the counter, remnants of a life she never explained. I stepped inside, aware of the space between us, the air thick with unspoken words. She handed me a cup of tea. Our fingers brushed, just a fraction of contact, but it felt like an agreement. We could cross some lines carefully, quietly, without destroying what was fragile. We sat at the small table in her kitchen. Silence filled the gaps, but it wasn't heavy this time. It felt deliberate, like holding a breath, the tension in the pause itself carrying more than words ever could. I started, then stopped. My throat tightened. Too many things I wanted to say, all tangled up in fear and hope. She looked at me, eyes steady. "It's okay," she said softly. Not dismissive, just accepting. "You can say it or not. Either way, I'm here." That small permission, so ordinary, so human, broke the dam. I let a quiet confession slip. Not loud, not dramatic, just enough. "I've been wanting to be here, with you, even if it's complicated." Her lips twitched, not quite a smile, more a recognition. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she poured herself a sip of tea, eyes on the cup, as if weighing my words against every boundary she'd drawn. Finally, she looked up. "I know." Her voice wasn't triumphant or relieved. It was steady, real, careful. "And I want it too. But we have to be careful." I nodded, relief folding into tension because careful still meant risking. Still meant admitting we wanted something that wasn't simple or easy. Still meant our lives, age, history, baggage were real and pressing. We sat in that quiet kitchen, hands occasionally brushing, sharing the warmth of tea and presence. No dramatic gestures, no declarations of love. Just acknowledgement. Just two people finally seeing each other, fully, without pretense. I exhaled, long and slow. She gave a slight nod, her hand resting near mine, not insisting, just existing. "Okay," I said, soft, almost whispered. She mirrored me. "Okay." And that was enough. A human connection, fragile and ordinary, but in that ordinary moment, entirely everything. Weeks passed, and the apartment settled into a rhythm that felt like ours without anyone announcing it. I stopped knocking at her door. She stopped smirking as if testing me. Instead, our routines intertwined. Coffee in the morning, tea in the afternoons, small gestures that spoke louder than words. I caught her at the bench in the park one Sunday. The sunlight struck just right through the branches, throwing patterns on the cracked pavement. She smiled faintly, the way she did when she was content but still calculating, still careful. I sat beside her. No urgency. No need to explain anything. At 8:47 a.m., I poured my black coffee into the chipped mug she had bought years ago. She stirred her tea, eyes flicking to mine, catching the faintest smile I hadn't planned to give her. The bench, the coffee, the silence, they had become a language we didn't need to define. Some days, she talked about work or errands or memories she hadn't shared before. Other days, we just existed in the same space, shoulders brushing, hands near enough to notice warmth, far enough to respect boundaries. I remembered the fountain, the park walks, the hallway brushes of fingers. Each memory folded into this one, layered, quiet, heavy with the life we had built between pauses. One evening, she handed me a mug, the steam curling toward my face, a small smirk on her lips. "You're slow," she said. Not reproach, just observation. I laughed softly, my hand brushing hers as I took it. That touch, tiny, ordinary, carried the weight of everything we'd almost lost, everything we'd finally allowed ourselves. We didn't need grand gestures or confessions anymore. Evenings in her apartment, the hum of the fridge, the faint scent of jasmine and old books, it all felt like home. Like someone had finally left the light on for me, and I didn't need to knock. I realized how quiet, small things, like coffee at 8:47, a brush of a hand, a bench in the park, had become profound. Life wasn't perfect. There were errands, distractions, obligations. But the space we shared, the routines we built, the pauses we allowed each other, they were ours. And in that quiet, I understood something only we could. That love didn't always need fireworks. Sometimes it lived in small agreements, in gentle acknowledgments, in the patience of showing up and waiting. I stirred my coffee, watching her hands wrap around her mug. She caught my gaze, and I felt it again, the recognition, the acceptance, the simple fact of being seen. "Okay," I said softly. She nodded. "Okay." And that was enough. Did this story stay with you? What kind of quiet, real love stories do you want to hear next?